Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this webinar entitled Free Zimbabwe, Continuing Deterioration of Human Rights in Zimbabwe. My name is Ruvimbo Samanga, and I will be moderating this panel. I'm an alumnus of the Center for Human Rights. This event has kindly been organized by the Center for Human Rights, Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria, and is hosted by the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit. The Center, as a human rights organization, found it important to convene this discussion and gather voices from the members of civil societies in Zimbabwe, international organizations, political representatives, and members of academia. This session is indeed being recorded and is also being streamed live on Facebook. To our participants, thank you for tuning into this session. We would really like to hear from you, and we would love to include your voice in the conversation. That said, kindly ask questions, share your comments, and even challenge some of the ideas today. And feel free to use the chat box panel on your screen throughout the session, and we will gladly take note of them. We will also have a few poll questions which will pop up on your screen at different intervals. Please be mindful of these, as we would appreciate everyone's prompt feedback. I'm sure already one of the poll questions has already popped up on your screen. Kindly make sure you scroll through the entire list and respond to all of the questions. At this juncture, I would like to introduce the content of this webinar, as well as our featured panelists. The current situation in Zimbabwe has attracted the attention of the international community. Incidents of police brutality, as well as the arrests of journalists and social activists alike, has sparked a movement known as #FreeZimbabwe, as well as #Zimbabwean Lives Matter, which have been trending on social media networks in recent weeks. More than 60 people in Zimbabwe have been arrested for protesting against corruption and a worsening economic crisis. And some activists, such as Hopewell Chinono and Jacob Mngarivume, are among those still currently detained. Among those arrested were award-winning Zimbabwean author Tsitsi Dangarembga and MDC-Alliance spokesperson Fadzai Mahere. The protesters have been charged with incitement to commit public violence. Such developments are unprecedented, and we can all agree that the happenings in Zimbabwe are worth having a discussion. So as we begin this webinar, ponder on the following. What is the perceived status of human rights in Zimbabwe? From where do such movements stem? What role does politics play in addressing citizenry concerns? And most importantly, in the face of public outcry, what will the responsible authorities do to respond? To help us engage on this subject, we have invited members of civil society, as well as two representatives from the political fraternity in Zimbabwe, the MDC-Alliance and the Zanu-PF party. From the program, you would have noticed that Mr. Nelson Chamisa had indeed intended to be a part of this conversation today and had gladly accepted our invite. However, he will not be joining us due to unforeseen circumstances. In his place, he has delegated Ms. Gladys Kudzaishe Hlatywayo, who is the Secretary for International Relations for the MDC-Alliance. And please allow me to note as well that we have extended an invitation to the Zanu-PF party to be a part of this conversation, and they are represented by the Director of Information and Publicity, Mr. Tafadzwa Mugwadi. Also, please note that Mr. Deprose Muchena, who is the Regional Director of Amnesty International's Regional Office for Southern Africa, has also kindly sent his apologies and could not be with us today. We also have with us Ms. Rosalind Hanzi, the Executive Director for the Zimbabwean Lawyers for Human Rights. Also joining us today is Ms. Ruwadzano Patience Makumbe, who is a Hillary Rodham Clinton Global Challenges Scholar and Asia Justice Coalition Fellow in Advocacy, Campaigns, and Communications. We also have Mr. Brian Kagoro, a Pan-Africanist and lawyer of note in the African human rights domain. In the next hour, I will humbly allow our featured speakers to make brief presentations, after which we will move into a Q&A session. We will have the speakers in the following order, starting with Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, followed by Mr. Tafadzwa Mugwadi, Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo, Ms. Rosalind Hanzi, and finally Mr. Brian Kagoro. I will humbly allocate 10 minutes plus or minus to each speaker before allocating a further 30 minutes to the Q&A session. But without further ado, I will hand over then to our first speaker, Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe. Please kindly take the floor.
Thank you, Ruvimbo, and thank you for having me join this discussion, very important discussion actually today. And I'll just start by highlighting that today I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and everything that I will say and express is entirely my own and does not represent any organization that I work with or that I am involved in any capacity. My presentation will try to give a reflection on what is happening in the country, but also look at the impact of this on young people in Zimbabwe and how possibly we can bring our thoughts together in terms of engaging and also assisting and paving way on interventions. So as we might all agree, it doesn't take an outsider to tell the people of Zimbabwe about the dear situation in the country, and that the current state of affairs needs to be redirected. Everyday lived realities and experiences themselves are telling, and people are forced to think of how they can do better or differently to see change in the country. So for instance, in the last year, there was an increase in food insecurity, and statistics from the World Bank have shown that as of 2009, 5.7 million people were living in extreme poverty. And this is a reality which we cannot run away from, but need to bring solutions to the table. So certainly it's become a situation where parents are worried for their children and young people are worried for their futures. And a recent report published by the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association also showed, for instance, how the informal sector has faced serious challenges, of course, prior to the lockdown period, but also has been exacerbated during the national lockdown people. And everyone can agree that this relates to people's livelihoods. So we see that it's become an issue of human dignity, and it's become an issue of people's everyday lives that is being affected. And it's important also for us to realize that what we are seeing now and what we have seen in the last few months has not just started. It has been a continuous vicious cycle of socioeconomic and political instability in the country. So the disintegration of the system has gone to the root of our humanity as a people. This has serious consequences to the existence and identity of people in general, but particularly so of young people. This also means that we see how our country has mistreated its young people with an expectation that they will still be contributing members of society, and also that they remain upright members of our society. Clearly, this is somewhat unfair and also to a greater extent, very unrealistic. However, when we look at the developments in the country over the last few years, we see that the resilience of young people in Zimbabwe is remarkable. And with all the challenges, many are coming through and standing up for what is right. It has never become a question as to whether Zimbabwean young people have a voice. They're speaking out and they're demanding a system premised on good governance that respects human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Young people are being custodians of their country, and they're taking the responsibility to do whatever they can to help protect their country. So with this in mind, I would say that exercising their constitutional rights at whatever degree does not constitute any unlawful conduct. And it is quite commendable that there has been peaceful interaction in all the efforts to claim and demand justice in the country. There's space for young people to disrupt, to reconstruct, and also to recreate should be there under normal circumstances, and their efforts should not be frustrated, as we are all working towards one goal, which should be driving every Zimbabwean, whether at political level or at civil society level or at community level. And this is the recreation of a Zimbabwe which works for all of us. It is a fact that young people are a backbone of our nation, and they are creating solutions in their communities, even in the face of a challenging economy and also very little support. However, it is said that as a country, there has not been efforts to truly allow the potential and expertise of our young people to contribute to the development and growth of our country. And when we look at the current state of affairs, it is truly unconstructive to exclude young people, and it is very unconstructive to denigrate young people, particularly due to their demand for justice, due to their demand for accountability. This is what we are saying now. I would say instead there should be a societal and a political will to harness the capacities and expertise that young people bring with them and that young people bring to the development of our country. We have seen the growing engagement of young people in political affairs of the country. This is particularly so because the political system has shaped the daily lives of people. So there's obviously that nexus and that connectivity between human rights and the protection of human rights in the country and the political structure and the political evolving in the country. So the solutions to Zimbabwe's problems do not lie with an individual or a political party. The solutions to the challenges that we are facing now are in the realization that there is need for things to be done differently in Zimbabwe. Our system has for so long disregarded and denounced accountability and has marginalized the majority. This is, I think, a serious challenge, and where there is no accountability, we have seen corruption, we have seen exclusion, and we have seen political elitism that are being upheld and that have become a consistent culture in our system. This needs to change, and young people have really taken a stand to call out the system that has failed them. Our political leaders need to realize that the country belongs to every Zimbabwean, and those in political office are only representatives of the people and should serve the people and ensure that the voices of people are heard. I think it's very unfortunate that when you speak to many young Zimbabweans, for example, their only source of hope for a better life is an opportunity to leave the country someday. That should not be the normal state of affairs of saying, I need to get the opportunity to leave the country. But at the same time, I also strongly believe that with political will and with sufficient drive, the trajectory of our country can certainly be changed. But for this to happen, it will take us doing things differently, but also harnessing some of the things that we have done away with. For example, empathy, for example, adopting a clear-mindedness and also adopting humility, being able to take a stand back and realize that we need to do things differently. So this is not only on the part of the people, but also on the political level. We need that sort of clear-mindedness, and we need that sort of engagement and realization that we need to incorporate a different stance and a different manner of doing things. My hope is that with this will make everyone somewhat move towards the scope of developing the country and also seeing growth in the country, but also at the same time realizing that we need to have young people, we need to have all members of the society respected, we need to have human rights championed, we need to have the rule of law respected as it is, and approach things differently and apply different solutions to the challenges that we are facing now. Just to highlight a few points that I think would be significant in all the initiatives that are currently take place and also all the efforts that are being implemented both at the political level and also in civil society and the community level. So the first one is that instead of ostracizing those who are challenging poor public service delivery, corruption, structural inefficiency, more constructive ways of responding should be employed to yield better results in the country. And the second point, which I feel is also one of the tools that we can use to yield better results in the country, is to embrace collaboration at all levels, and also to be able to design strategies and to design initiatives and to design the manner in which we move forward based on collaboration as a country. The third point is that free expression and free association are crucial in all democracies, and we cannot compromise on this as a country. Politics should be akin to this, and politics should be alive to this. Limiting freedom of expression will only perpetuate a culture of marginalization, political elitism, and the system of a broken Zimbabwe that we are seeing now. The fourth point is that digital activism and civic engagement are a clear indication that people, and particularly young people in Zimbabwe, do care about the political system, but also about the manner in which the country is being governed. And also it shows that young people in Zimbabwe are employing their creativity and engaging in these issues. So at the same time, we cannot even question, or we cannot even have any doubt to the extent to which young people have the capacity to contribute to the country, and also how the potential of the young people in Zimbabwe can be harnessed. And my final point would be that as a country and also as a people, it's time that we empower our young people, for they are the leaders of today and also the leaders of tomorrow. Collaboration of both young and new leaders is not only beneficial in accelerating the growth and development of our country, but will promote idea generation. And I think that is very critical and is central to us seeing a change in terms of what is happening in Zimbabwe. Thanks, Ruvimbo.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ruwadzano. I enjoyed especially how you spoke about bringing the young voices together to pave interventions. Indeed, it doesn't take outsiders to comment that the current state of affairs requires urgent intervention. As you correctly said, 5.7 million people are living in extreme poverty. Parents are worried about their children, and youth are worried about their future. So it is unconstructive to not include youth in development of the nation, as they are indeed the primary beneficiaries of future development. And indeed, the country belongs to all who reside within. But when speaking to the youth, often their only source of hope is outside of the borders. So again, I agree with you, there needs to be a restructuring that involves adding the voice of the youth and also introducing certain processes and fundamental human aspects such as humanity, which have previously been done away with. Collaboration of both old and young leaders will indeed bring about idea generation. But despite all of this, the resilience of young people in Zimbabwe is indeed remarkable, and they are indeed the custodians of good governance. Just a reminder that exercising your human rights is not a punishable offense. We would like to move on to our next speaker at this point. Thank you so much, Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, for your words. Unfortunately, Mr. Tafadzwa Mugwadi is yet to join us, so we will humbly move on to our next speaker in the list, who will be Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo. Ms. Gladys, you may take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank the Center for Human Rights for giving us the opportunity to be part of this important dialogue. The Zimbabwean crisis is indeed something that we need to discuss about and to think through solutions in terms of what can be done to end this crisis. I will do two things during my presentation. I will speak to the situation, just give an overview in terms of the situation. Then I will then go to what we propose as the Movement for Democratic Change Alliance in terms of the solutions. So obviously the first port of call is to define the crisis in Zimbabwe. We humbly submit as the Movement for Democratic Change that the crisis in Zimbabwe is a crisis of governance and legitimacy, arising out of successive disputed elections, but also the November coup that gave rise to a securocratic state where the military is now the decisive power bloc in terms of the politics of the country. We submit that there is no social contract, or the social contract has broken down between those that are governing and those that are governed. There is lack of trust, and the manifestations that we are now seeing of that governance and legitimacy crisis is the socio-economic implosion, corruption, human rights abuses, shrinking democratic space. So in terms of the socio-economic implosion, we are seeing that at the current moment, we are talking of more than 800% inflation. We are talking about 63% of Zimbabweans living below the poverty datum line, 80% or to 90%, Zimbabweans being unemployed. 7.7 million Zimbabweans are in need of food aid, with more than 2 million actually being from urban centers. And this is a new phenomenon that we are seeing in terms of the deepening crisis. We have also seen, corruption, happening in the country, in the, various state institutions. being linked, some of these cases actually being linked to the first family, Mr. Mnangagwa himself and his family. And we have seen impunity in terms of how the government is dealing with these cases of corruption, contrary to what they told us when they came in November 2017, that they are a new dispensation, that they are a second republic, that they will do things differently. We are seeing a continuation, if not an escalation, of the situation. In terms of human rights abuses, we have seen how the military, has been abused, used, and turned against the people of Zimbabwe. On 1 August, we saw how, 6 people were killed in the streets of Harare. There was a Motlanthe commission that was set up to look into these abuses. They made recommendations, including the recommendation that, Section 210 of the Constitution that says we need to have an independent complaints mechanism where members of the public can report cases of abuse, in cases where the security forces are involved. All of these recommendations have not been implemented. There were also implementations around compensation of the victims, also recommendations around accountability in terms of the military personnel that were involved in these extrajudicial killings. But nothing has been done. On 19 January again, 2019, 17 people were killed by the security forces during the January protest, and again, nothing was done. There were also quite a number of women that were raped, and nothing was done in terms of bringing the perpetrators to account. In August again, 2019, as a party, as the Movement for Democratic Change, we mobilized our members to express, our dissatisfaction with the economic situation, the failure by the government to meet the socio-economic needs of the citizens, but also the deteriorating human rights situation. But unfortunately, our protests were prohibited. We were given prohibition orders that were unconstitutional, and also our members were targeted for abductions. They were targeted for unlawful arrests, extrajudicial killings. We also saw just recently, around the 31st of July, citizens were mobilizing, again responding to the output legitimacy. Because this government does not only, lack in terms of input legitimacy, in terms of the way that it ushered itself in the corridors of power, but also output legitimacy in terms of actually meeting the needs of the people and meeting the promises that they made to the people of Zimbabwe. So again, citizens were exercising their democratic rights. Section 59 of the Constitution is quite clear that citizens do have the right to demonstrate and petition, right to peacefully demonstrate and petition. And citizens have consistently been doing this, demonstrating in a peaceful way, like what we saw on the 31st of July. Citizens, the few citizens that came out, they did that, peacefully. But the kind of, response that we got from the regime was disproportionate, and it resulted in a lot of abductions. As the Movement for Democratic Change, we recorded more than 148 cases of human rights abuses just associated with the July 31st protest, just against our members. And these included 38 abductions. We have seen what has happened to Hopo Chingono, Jacob Ngarivume, Kurawone, our youth national organizer, who is languishing in prison as well. The abductions that were happening, the stories of Tawanda Mchehiwa, the stories of Nonkolo Maposa, who was sexually abused and abducted. The list goes on. We have also seen shrinking democratic space in an attempt to use captured state institutions to dismember our political party, the Movement for Democratic Change. We have seen how the courts are being used to deliver judgments that are questionable. We have seen how the military has been used to capture, our headquarters, which is the Morgan Richard Trangirai House. That was done in the middle of the night without any court order whatsoever. We have also seen how the parliament, through the Speaker of Parliament, is being used to recall our members of parliament, when the last election was quite clear in terms of who was voted for by the people. And we see this is actually an extension of the legitimacy crisis, where the votes of the people are now being given to someone else who was also on the ballot, by the way, when we went for the 2018 election. So all of these issues are issues that point to a governance and legitimacy crisis. I would then move on to the solutions in terms of what we submit as the Movement for Democratic Change. What is it that can be done to extricate Zimbabwe out of the current crisis? We submit humbly that dialogue is the only way to proceed. An inclusive dialogue framework is important, and an inclusive dialogue framework that is scaffolded by the international community, the Southern African Development Community, African Union, and the greater international community is the only plausible solution in terms of how we can move forward as a country. And this dialogue must have a facilitator, an agreed facilitator who is trusted by the stakeholders in Zimbabwe. And this dialogue must lead to a comprehensive reform agenda, looking at reforms that are necessary to change our governance culture in Zimbabwe around electoral reforms, security sector reforms, media reforms, looking at a new social contract, looking at past human rights abuses. We do have a National Peace and Reconciliation Commission that was set up through the 2013 constitution, but regrettably, this important organ has not been able to bring justice to the victims of, past cycles of human rights abuses, and it's important for us to address particular questions. So transitional justice is important going forward. We need to make sure that these reforms are implemented before we get to the next election, so that at least the next election is not a disputed election and we break the cycle of disputed election. I will stop here and hopefully we can have a conversation after, in the question and answer segment, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo. Thank you for giving an overview of the situation as well as what the MDC proposes as solutions. You firstly started by defining the crisis and submitting that the crisis in Zimbabwe is indeed one of legitimacy, mentioning as well the role that the military has played and how this has weakened the social contract and level of trust between government and the polity. Some solutions amongst others that you mentioned include an independent complaints mechanism, as well as compensation to victims, which all speak to matters of accountability. On noting Section 59 of the Constitution, it provides that the right to peaceful protests and demonstrations may be exercised by citizens, which right has indeed been exercised in response to perceived public dissatisfaction. However, then you noted that there was a shrinking democratic space, which then justifiably speaks to the need for further dialogue and progressive conversation on both sides, that is between public and government. So dialogue is indeed important. Most importantly, it needs to be inclusive dialogue, which, as you mentioned, should be scaffolded by the international community and more so facilitated by independent and objective members of society. I'd like to thank you so much for the discussion on transitional justice, which we hope will resonate with the participants today. And without further ado, we will kindly move on to Mr. Brian Kagoro, as our two other speakers unfortunately are running a bit late. So I will now call on Mr. Brian Kagoro to kindly take the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you to the Center for the kind invitation. There are various factors that are important to understanding the Zimbabwean situation. There are certain underlying determinants of the multi-layered crisis. And that crisis is socio-economic, which means it has a historical component that relates to an economy constructed to serve the narrow interest of a white minority and largely never intended to serve the interests of the rest of the black. And bounded in the socioeconomic component of the crisis are four factors: land and agrarian reform, the factory question, which is largely the labor question. The third issue is the vision of economic structural transformation and inclusive economy. And the fourth element is a transgenerational economy that creates value not just for this current generation, but for future generations. And in it is enmeshed the class question, right? And so we will continuously talk about the elite, but it's important to locate the peasantry, the working poor, and the unemployed in the conversation about the crisis. The second is the political crisis. I think Gladys has given the contours of that crisis, but suffice it to say that within the political crisis is a crisis of ethics, is a crisis of ideology that sometimes torments both the ruling party and the opposition, which is what kind of society, beyond the cliches about freedom, justice, indigenization, what kind of society, what kind of institutions, what kind of leadership would we require? And of course, as I have said, we have an ethical crisis. We have perfected corruption to the extent that within certain bands of elites, it's now taken as an entitlement that if you fought for the liberation of the country, you are entitled to loot, you are entitled to ransack the state, and no one should be able to question you on that. That the sacrifice of liberation is entitlement to loot. I wish to underscore that part of the conversation we must be having is understanding the liberation war and the liberation struggle. Now, let me define it before I move forward, because it is often defined narrowly or wrongly. There were 5 tenets to the liberation war in Zimbabwe. The first tenet was the rehumanization of Black people who had been dehumanized and dispossessed by white colonial settlers. Now, that rehumanization was linked to the second thing, which was a return or redistribution and distribution of land and other resources. The third, which is something that Rhodesia had deprived Black people, was universal adult suffrage. You will hear Tongogara and others saying what we are fighting for is one man, one vote. At the time, they were not yet gender conscious. So they used to use the term one man, one vote, which essentially means all adults of voting age should be able to vote. So that universal adult suffrage, and Tongogara framed it as free, fair, and credible election. The next component that's related to it is a very interesting thing about the liberation struggle. It was justice and inclusion and diversity. So from Tongogara to Joshua Nkomo, they kept on saying, we're not fighting against the whites. We're fighting against the system, to use the words of Bob Marley, that holds one race superior to another. And this idea that holds one gender or sex superior to another, that holds one age group superior to another, one ethnic group or tribe superior to another. They were fighting to destroy the system. And therefore, one of the aspirations of the War of Liberation was inclusion, diversity, and equality. Finally, the War of Liberation was about a long-term intergenerational vision. Every genuine liberator who spoke on the subject of liberation always talked about how they were fighting so that their children and great-grandchildren would live in a better Zimbabwe than they themselves had been raised in. characterized by greater freedom, greater justice, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to suggest that at the ethical and political level, we are finding the bastardization and narrow construction of the war of liberation as the mask, alibi for impunity. And it is useful that we unmask that pretentiousness and hypocritical approach to the narrative of liberation. But I think there is an ideological crisis, and it's important for us to understand the parameters of this ideological crisis. We have a government that talks left and leaves right. We have a government that appropriates left-wing politics for purposes of suppressing opponents. It appropriates an anti-imperial and anti-colonial agenda when it suits it. But when it's convenient, the same government hobnobs, sells off portions of the country to all sorts of foreigners without any regard to accountability and transparency to local populations that will be affected, or the nation and future generations. This ideological crisis requires that we ask fundamental questions. What does it mean to be Zimbabwean? Under what terms do we want to live together as a nation? And this will define our social contract. But beyond this, there is a debilitating short-termism in our governance system, that everything is kukia for the short term. The long-term planning and vision that characterized our movement at independence has since died. And this has resulted in clashing paradigms of leadership, of institutions, of citizenship, and of governance. And I'd like to remind us that as we critique the human rights situation in Zimbabwe, what we're experiencing is the ghost of Rhodesia that has refused to die. The Rhodesian state was characterized by, number one, the persistent use of force against citizens. Number two, the use of fraudulent means to turn each citizen into a spy against the other. Number three, coercion as an element of its interaction with the Black population. And it reserved for itself the right and monopoly to tell lies, to malign, and to restrain freedom when it suited it. So in that sense, you would see that the struggle in Zimbabwe, the crisis in Zimbabwe, will have dimensions relating to nation building. And that is why you still could have a government minister issue a rebuttal of a statement issued by the Catholic Bishops' Conference and include in it ethnic or tribal innuendo, right? And this idea of inclusion, diversity, equality, and participatory leadership. Tsitsidangarembwa defined it this way recently. She said, we have constructed in our country the notion of a singular identity. And that identity is you are either a Zanu-PF supporter or you are not a Zimbabwean. If you are a critic of Zanu-PF, your rights are not respected. Or at some stage after expression, you will suffer consequences of that freedom. This idea of a one-party state mentality that sees difference as enmity or crime or criminality is something that we need to deal with, because it's a combination of the ghost of Rhodesia and also a remnant of the failed one-party state project that Zanu-PF tried to construct and did not succeed in the 80s. In the context of this milieu, we've had an elite capture of the state, an elite capture of processes of lawmaking, an elite capture of the judiciary, an elite capture of law enforcement, policing, and military and security. And this has led to a conflation of securocracy with the political party as well as the economy, so that it's different to distinguish economic interests from political party interests, which in turn are now dominated by a clique. And so this clique, though, has been fragmented for some time. And Zimbabweans like to refer to this as factionalism within Zanu-PF. I want to suggest to the audience that the fragmentation within the elite is a much broader concept, and that this elite within the ruling echelons is linked to an external elite within the broader international community, within international capital, whether it's east, west, or south. So the idea of an overarching political vision that's not tethered to individual interest of family oligarchs and cliques no longer quite exists in the country. That's why we are struggling to define that collective and shared value base and vision. And COVID-19 has come into this context, this confusing and confused context, and brought in many complications. The gravy train that the elite had constructed, the sham of looting over years, the weak state of institutions, the poor remuneration of public servants, teachers, health workers, and so on and so forth, has been dramatized by COVID, where elite accumulation is insufficient to protect ordinary Zimbabweans. The health workers and health institutions that are expected to protect Zimbabweans are in a sad state of disrepair. And this is symptomatic of a greedy, corrupt, ideologically moribund, and unethical leadership. And so the country dithers between the bane of short-termism and the curse of a moribund leadership, right? That adopts temporary responses to long-term problems, whether they are of water, electricity, health, and also has absolutely no limits when it comes to looting, right? Now, COVID has, however, presented a new opportunity because the regime was facing many challenges internally and also from oppositional and other forces. COVID has become the guise of a new autocracy, that you can use COVID restraint regulations in order to contain citizen expression of discontent at the extent to which you are looting, at the extent to which you are destroying institutions. I wish to remind the listeners of the interconnectedness and indivisibility of rights. I support portions of what is called indigenization. I am opposed to foreign sanctions. And in this I differ with many. However, I don't see how one can fight for every Zimbabwean to have the right to land and not fight for Zimbabweans to have social protection, not fight for doctors and nurses and teachers to have better working conditions, and not fight for NGOs and ordinary people to have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. The continuum of rights defines a citizenship that's not confined to holding a piece of soil and having no other dimension of humanity. So it is important that we challenge the notion that if you ask for freedom of expression, you are therefore against land reform. In any event, the percentage of young people that benefited from the land reform program is under 24%. The percentage of women that benefited from the land reform program is less than 17%. These are official statistics. It therefore means even that land question must still be reopened for purposes of gender equality and generational justice and equality. It would seem to me, therefore, that the business of constructing national consent, national consensus, and economic structural transformation requires that we be honest with three things. Number one, we be honest about the fact that there are external factors and influences, whether you call them imperial or whatever you call them, that have designs on Zimbabwe, right? But it is not these external influences that have somehow entered the hearts in a demonic way of our leadership and caused them to steal and loot empty our coffers. just between 2017 and now, I dare not go before that, when Mugabe was talking about 6 billion and more. The amounts of money that have officially been communicated by ZAC and through arrest of certain senior people through this catch and release process is in excess of 1.5 billion. Let me paint it for those who are not Zimbabweans in clear terms. $1.5 billion would have bought almost all the major referral hospital, oxygen, PPE, ventilators, and been able to pay the doctors a better salary based on their demands. The fact that this went into individual pockets shows that whilst there may be constraints emanating from the fact that Zimbabwe cannot benefit from debt rescheduling or new debt because of the restraints of Residera, there is a bigger constraint. Our own leadership hates us more than the imperialists. That when we are on the ground, they kick us. When we are on the ground, they loot from us. They buy Lamborghinis and all sorts of expensive trinkets. This conspicuous consumption, this primitive accumulation shows a leadership that is ideologically bankrupt, a leadership that has absolutely no patriotic commitment to the transformation of the nation. And the rhetoric of transformation must be debunked. Which therefore leads us to the question, where to with the question and subject of constitutionalism and human rights? And why should the region, SADC and Africa, be concerned? And I'll end with that. Look, my friends, any other circumstance, Zimbabwe could play delinquent neighbor, and it would not worry South Africa too much, and Botswana and Zambia. But recent history shows that repression and economic difficulties combined produced the largest number of economic refugees and political refugees. This outward migration to escape penury and repression in the context of COVID is a threat to regional peace and security. Number two, Zimbabwe is one of the wealthiest African countries in terms of its human capital, as well as its natural resource endowment. I have for years called it Little Congo, DRC. Zimbabwe has gold, it has emeralds, it has diamond, it has platinum. For a small country with such a small population and such a huge landmass, Zimbabwe should be wealthier than Switzerland. Zimbabwe should be far ahead of the United Kingdom in terms of development. But you cannot develop beyond the mindset of those that lead you and beyond the ability of policy and institutions to see long-term and see value in your own people. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that we would rather have the neighbors becoming candid with their cousins in Harare than have Americans and other foreigners coming to try and order affairs in Zimbabwe. The history of liberation, the pride of being Africans, requires that we can no longer be indifferent to the repression in Harare, the abductions. We can no longer be indifferent to the abuse of institutions and processes, right? Others have suggested solutions on how we resolve this process, whether it's through dialogue. All that I demand as a Zimbabwean is that the leadership must realize that most of them are above the age of 64. According to official Zimbabwean census figures, that means they constitute 4% of the population. The people they are repressing and refusing to express themselves peacefully regarding their plight constitute 96%. We have experience of being ruled by a white minority, which was 3%. Now we have the experience of a black minority, a clique of 4% that intends to hold the country at ransom. This is not a political party position. If someone is a member of Zanu-PF and they are ideologically astute, a member of MDC and ideologically astute and patriotic, we all should be saying, we fought Ian Smith, not in order to install blacksmiths in his place, right? Samora Machel put it this way: we did not eliminate colonial white oppression so that we could indigenize oppression. And Julius Nyerere says that we behaved as though when given the chance, we would govern better. But instead, autocracy and worse things have happened under us. And so I'm asking everyone campaigning for human rights in Zimbabwe. Human rights are the product of social struggle. And that struggle will have many fronts. It is not a political party struggle, because tomorrow it may be a different political party in power. If the values and the institutions that are dear to protecting inclusion, equality, and diversity are bastardized, are destroyed, captured, or weakened, today you may be a beneficiary of this dysfunction, but tomorrow you may be a victim. Ask Mr. Mugabe. And when you plead for human rights, you will not have too many people listening to you. So I would thank you all for the solidarity, but thank you all. I would like you to understand, let's not just critique tyranny in Harare without locating it within its historical and other precedents. And critiquing tyranny in Harare does not mean we become accomplices with some of the imperial interests, because their activities in Africa and in Asia and elsewhere have resulted in destruction. And to be anti-imperial and pan-African is not inconsistent with holding a black regime behaving worse than the white colonial apartheid or Rhodesian regime to account. It is a revolutionary obligation for any African to ensure that we don't allow our own leadership to behave worse than their colonial masters did.
Thank you very much, Brian, for those insightful comments. Indeed, as you correctly stated, this is a multifaceted situation with a lot of underlying determinants. This is a socioeconomic crisis with historical components, including, as you mentioned, racial politics. But just to recap for the benefit of the audience, some of the themes which you touched on were firstly, the role of land and agrarian reform, the factor of the labor question, as well as the vision of economic structural transformation and an inclusive economy, and finally, transgenerational economy, and in this enmeshed the class question. So of course, you made hefty discussions on the role of the elite, and secondly, that this was a political crisis which was expounded on further by Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo. So within the political fraternity, you identify that there is indeed a crisis of ethics and ideology, and you guided us in the ideological implications and crisis between left and right-wing policy adoption. Ultimately, the will of the citizens will determine how they wish to be governed, and that this should determine the social contract. In doing so, one needs to acknowledge the interconnectivity of rights. For instance, fighting for the right to land does not have to be contrary to the right to social protection within this broad social governance framework. It is important then to challenge the notions that these rights are mutually exclusive. And as a result of this dichotomy, unfortunately, we now have a phenomenon known as economic refugeeism, which is a threat to regional peace and security, despite the fact that Zimbabwe has a vast wealth of resources. But Mr. Kagoro, as you correctly said, you cannot develop within the mindset of the authorities and within the confines of the policy implementation. And indeed, there is urgent need for the transformation or the rhetoric transformation to be deconstructed within the Zimbabwean context. Thank you very much for this enlightening discussion. I would like to pose a few questions to the speakers before I open up the floor to our participants to address their concerns. Firstly, starting with Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, I would like to know from you, do you suppose that the liberation vision was in alignment with the hopes and aspirations of the youth? And how do you suppose then that the youth can take control of their destinies, even from within the borders of Zimbabwe?
Thanks, Rainbow. I think Brian has sort of given us the historical overview of how Zimbabwe came to be. And I think this is very important and also particularly important for us young people to understand. But at the same time, it is also important for us to look at where we are today. And I'm going to possibly respond to your question in that light. In as much as we look at what is happening today, the system is not working in the best interest of young people. And we know that young people are the majority, and young people are literally being ignored in the country. And where they are speaking out, they are being frustrated, and they are being put in a position where they have to find other ways of making change in the country. And this is very difficult, particularly where you have the government with the arrogance, and where you have the government bringing in responses that are not only constructive, but also a frustration and meant to ensure that anyone else who thinks of following in that footstep, or who thinks of following in that way of speaking out, does not receive the support that they require. It is also important that we, as young people, realize that we have so much power and that we are the majority, and that there's so much that can be done. I think when we look at the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter that is currently going on, it has really done so much in terms of bringing in many voices into the conversation. It has done so much in making people realize that something needs to be done and that things need to change. So certainly young people are already doing what needs to be done in terms of bringing in everyone, not just in Zimbabwe, but also bringing in voices from all over Africa and all around the world to contribute to this dire situation that we find ourselves in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe. In fact, youth are indeed the majority, and in order for youth empowerment to occur, there must necessarily be a sense of enablement within the country. Thank you for answering that question. I will move on to Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo. I would like to hear from you. How do you resonate with the topic of political ideology crisis as posed by Mr. Brian Kagoro? And do you suppose that even within the opposition party politics, there may be some ideological shortcomings?
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to put on my video. Thank you so much for that question. I totally agree with the submissions of Mkoma Brian Kagoro on the crisis of ideology. If you look at what is happening in Zanu-PF, especially post the November coup, you do not sense, you do not get a sense as to whether Zanu-PF is a right-wing party or a left-wing party, or whether they are social democrats, or you don't get that sense when you look at the policies that they are churning out on a daily basis. It looks like it's a concoction and they don't really know exactly what they are doing. But speaking from the MDC-Alliance perspective, we are a social democratic party. We believe in justice, we believe in solidarity, we believe in equality. And that has defined our struggle ever since 1999. That is the reason why, the question of human rights is always central to our struggles. This is the reason why we always stand in solidarity with those who have their human rights violated by the Zanu-PF regime. So as a political party, I do not see any way where we have shown, lack of clarity in terms of our ideology. Even if you look at our policies, our policy documents, they always stand with the poor. They always stand with the marginalized, and that, defines who we are, and that defines how we respond to any situation. As a party. So I would not think that we are, ideologically bankrupt like our colleagues in Zanu-PF. I think we have always tried to stick to our ideology. We are social democrats, and that's the reason why we are actually participating even in this platform, because it's talking about human rights and it's so central to our values as a political party.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo. Indeed, the entire premise of this webinar today is to investigate the link between human rights and politics, as indeed they are intrinsically connected. Thank you for your answer to that question. And lastly, I'll move on to Mr. Brian Kagoro, just to investigate the concept of Pan-Africanism in a bit more deeper context. Do you perhaps presume that the concept of Pan-Africanism necessitates that regional neighbors make a fortified effort to intervene in regional affairs? And what impact, if any, would this have on the sovereign rights of Zimbabwe?
In both political science and practice, sovereignty does not reside or reposit in an abstraction called the state. Sovereignty resides in the people. And the African Union has, through the Ezulwini framework, as well as the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, and through the AU Shared Values Instruments, agreed to shift away from non-intervention to the principle of non-indifference. Let me dramatize this for you. If you take a non-intervention lens, it would have meant that when South Africans were being butchered by the apartheid regime, the neighbors could splendidly sit, fold their hands and say that's a domestic matter. Equally so for Zimbabwe. Mozambique and Zambia would not have offered the sort of solidarity because that would have interfered with the sovereignty of Rhodesia. I want to be categoric here that human rights don't necessarily lead to democracy, to equality, and poverty eradication. That's why I put in the issue of economic structural transformation. If our human rights lens, our human rights advocacy does not link to these fundamental questions, including the question of devolving power and fiscal decentralization within a country such as Zimbabwe, it would be inadequate to write in a constitution that all regions of the country are equal and not reflect this equality through fiscal decentralization and devolution that enable greater participation and co-creation of development by those who live closest to the issues that affect them, and so on and so forth. But Pan-Africanism as a value, and I want to say this categorically, was about the equal humanity, was about dignity, was about freedom, was also about unity and transformation. And in essence, Pan-Africanism does not mean that you exercise solidarity with tyranny. Pan-Africanism is first a people-to-people ideology, that you connect with other people out of empathy to ensure that their full humanity is guaranteed. And let's not ask false questions about liberation ideology and the youth today. Being youth is not a permanent state. So it's useful for those who are youth today to remember that something that we learned many years ago, you can be a class in yourself, but you need to be a class for yourself, right? That class consciousness about collective benefit, collective aspiration is important. But there's another consciousness that I would urge young people to have. All struggle is about continuity. There are Chitepo, Tongogara, even Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo were youth when they started fighting for their vision of Zimbabwe. And that vision could not have been the be-all and end-all. The current generation of youth, as Frantz Fanon puts it, its generation must define its mission, discover it, and fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. This generation of youth must see what continuities of struggle and values and aspirations are there between itself and previous liberation generations, and what new imperatives link it and future generations. And it is that consciousness that actually forces me to say that struggle is local, it is national, and it is global. Struggling against domestic tyranny without looking at the global architecture of tyranny, of populist forces, racist forces, becomes problematic. So the discrimination against Africans generally, and Africa generally, is twofold. It is by leaders who I said are ideologically and ethically bankrupt, but by people within global centers of decision-making who think that we were better off being colonized by them and directed by them. And as an African, you must fight that dual struggle against indigenous oppression as well as global architecture of oppression, because your self-determination always must have an external and internal focus lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kagoro. Indeed, sovereignty resides in the people. Thank you very much for delineating the difference between non-intervention versus non-indifference, and that Pan-Africanism as a value is about the equal humanity, dignity, freedom, unity, and transformation of the people and society. And this does not mean, of course, exercising alignment with tyranny, but rather with humanity. And I appreciate your very detailed response in that regard. So without further ado, and having heard from our speakers, I will now give our participants an opportunity to respond to a quick poll. And as you respond to this poll, I would also ask that you continue to generate and ponder over some questions for our lovely panel who has expounded further on the situation, both political, ideological, and socio-economic in the Zimbabwe society. And we want to once again just thank you so much, Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo, and as well Mr. Brian Kagoro for having taken the time to share your infinite knowledge with us and for further explaining this link between human rights and politics. So once again, if you can kindly make sure you scroll through the entire list for the poll and answer the questions therein. And then we will move on to our question and answer session. So as you continue to insert your questions into the chat box, we'd also like to give opportunity to some of our audience members to ask some questions live to our panelists. So I'll firstly call on Dr. Thompson Chengeta. You may go ahead and address the panelists.
Thank you very much, Ruvimbo. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by first thanking the panelists for expressing very important points on the current situation in Zimbabwe, which of course need all Zimbabweans to be really rallying, especially in support of victims of human rights violations. So I just have a couple of questions, and I will try to be as short as possible. The first question which I have comes as a comment and also as a question, and it relates to aspects of legal values and the dictates of public international law or international law norms, as far as expressions of what Mr. Brian Kagoro was referring to as internal and external self-determination, which I really agree with in terms of Pan-Africanism. I wondered, and I wanted to pose this as a question. In this digital age, and where the fight for human rights, largely occur on internet or on platforms such as Twitter, I just wondered, if, for example, international values or like international law on diplomacy has changed, so to say. For example, I want to give example here about foreign embassies, Western embassies in particular in Zimbabwe, where I would like to start from what Mr. Brian Nicholas, the U.S. ambassador, said a couple of weeks ago on the U.S. Embassy Twitter, where he said, and I quote, "To those who deny America's right to speak out on their fate, let me remind you, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Yet, clearly not trying to undermine the role that is played by foreign embassies in these human rights dire straits in Zimbabwe. Yet we have clear international law, for example, in terms of Article 41(1) of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and Article 51(1) of the Vienna Conventions on Consular Relations, which clearly state that members of diplomatic missions, embassies or consulate have a duty to respect the laws and regulations of the receiving state, and that they have a duty not to interfere in the internal matters of that particular state. So whether we may not agree with this particular law, it's an international law norm that exists, which both Zimbabwe and all the foreign embassies we are currently in Zimbabwe are party to. And of course, some may say that, what does it matter? They are supporting our cause. So why should it matter? And this is where, again, I come to the aspect of always being careful, because the government of Mnangagwa, which we may not like today, and like the support that is currently being perhaps given by these embassies, is it in the interest of African countries, for example, to allow, the perhaps crisscrossing of these diplomatic relations laws that are in place? Because if you look on how the same embassies who will be claiming that we want to speak for justice for everyone, I looked, for example, I actually did research. The embassy of the United Kingdom, the European Union embassies in America during the time when the Black Lives Matter was happening, when the day on 25th of May, when Floyd was killed, no one actually followed up on that particular aspect. No one tweeted about that. But yet when the same things are happening in African countries, we find those embassies saying perhaps those laws don't matter. So I just wanted to hear a comment on that from Mr. Kagoro. Thank you very much.
Hello, Mr. Brian Kagoro. I think that comment and question was directed.
I thought you would take a few so that at least we hear a diverse range. But I'm guided by you. Do you want me to respond to just this one? There may be others that are related.
Not a problem at all. I think I will go ahead and mention some of the questions from the panel. So for you, Brian, someone has asked here, is there a right to self-determination crisis currently in Zimbabwe? That is one of the first questions. And secondly, and I suppose this reiterates the question I had already asked you before, should South Africa take a hard stance against Zimbabwe because their quiet diplomacy will continue to cause problems for them? And thirdly, and I suppose this is more of a comment rather than a question, as a born free, that is after 1980, at this point, we wonder if the liberation ideology was even that ideal for equality in the first place. How could we, or how could they go against those ideals? I suspect that even in the liberation struggle phase, violence and a power struggle was already the norm in the societal culture. So Brian, I'm not sure if you would like to go ahead and answer these questions.
Yeah, okay. Let me let me start. I don't know if you can hear me, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, I can hear you.
Chair, Rua, if you follow Twitter and you listen to young people exchanging on the situation in Zimbabwe, I want you and every other young person on this platform to be honest. Do you think the language you use is violent, peaceful? Do you use insults? Do you bully people who are different who have different views from yourself? Why am I raising this issue? When Bonfries say, were there power struggles and during the liberation struggle? Of course there were. When you bring human beings together, you're going to generate conflict. Nobody had gone to a PhD school on diversity management. It's a value that we must learn through discipline. But what worries me is not so much what these old people who are in the departure lounge of life and politics do. What worries me is just following young people who are engaging each other in politics on the cyberspace. How vicious they tend to be towards each other and towards any form and manner of difference. This makes us, if we consider ourselves young, not different from this generation of ruthless and intolerant elders. So I would say that age is not an ideological position. Age is not an ethical position. Age is something that can be harnessed so we can have very old young people, very young, with very old ideas. And unfortunately, if you watch the internet, a lot of young people have very old habits, old ideas, sexist, misogynistic, and so on and so forth. Number two, I mean, the question of whether South Africa should take a strong stance against Zimbabwe or a soft stance is answered by politics and economic interest and security interest. And a lot of academic work has gone into this, but let me simplify it this way, Chairperson. South Africa's largest trading partner in the region is Zimbabwe. South Africa businesses are invested in Zimbabwean mines, they're invested in Zimbabwean retail, Zimbabwean agriculture. So those business interests will determine whether South Africa takes a stance that makes it seemingly hostile to Harare or not. But they are also political. And this has nothing to do with the liberation time solidarities. It's a fiction that we've made up. Zanu-PF and ANC did not have a bromance during the liberation struggle. There have been attempts at reconstructing that history. ANC was closer to ZAPU, and because of the persecution that ZAPU and ZIPRA suffered, ZANU was not necessarily until after the Unity Accord ANC's closest ally. But there is a collective of these liberation movements against hostile foreign interference, imperial interference. So they don't want to take any action that opens them up to a proxy regime in Zimbabwe that does not serve what they see as the collective interest. So there is, whether we think it's reasonable or not as human rights defenders, we must engage and appreciate what it means, because it is not half as useless as we would like to say, because these countries were involved in trying to stop the invasion of Libya. They were involved in trying to stop what happened in Iraq. So they, at a level of power, they associate any pronouncements by certain global powers in its most fatal consequence, which is hostile takeover of the political space for purposes of economic colonization. Now, the other bit is social. I already talked about thousands of Zimbabweans. I mean, 25% of Zimbabwe's population is rumored to be in South Africa. Now, Zimbabwe is not a province of South Africa.
Not rumored,
it's useful that I say rumored because when Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was Minister of Home Affairs, they had figures trying to determine how many people from each country were here. Their figure didn't go to the 4 million that had been estimated. So I think it's useful. I'd rather work with an in-between figure, that the statistics themselves are likely to be conservative because there'll be many undocumented that you can't reach, but also that the estimates, some of the estimates are likely to be extravagant. Now, that's, for me, that will determine what South Africa essentially does. And I think that South Africa needs to be firm for two reasons. An activist said in 1984, 1983, that Zimbabwe is the trailer and South Africa is the movie. That whatever happens in Zimbabwe, whether it's the land reform struggles, the corruption struggles, the factionalism in the ruling party, is likely to happen in South Africa on a grander scale. Whether this is true or not, South Africa really just needs to deal with this because it may have to deal with the Zimbabwe type fallout going into the future. Is there a self-determination crisis? I think that what marked the movement of liberation and what distinguishes this generation of folk who may have been in the liberation struggle and the previous generation of liberators is this: there was a symbiotic connection between the masses and the leadership. And the leadership non-pretentiously represented objectively what it saw as the interest of the broad mass. Unfortunately, the current leadership represents itself, its families, and its ethnic group or clan. So that is why there is a disconnect between the masses who are beginning to protest at exclusion and alienation from politics and the economy and the leadership. And it is important for us, whether you looked at what happened during the coup, you looked at many other things that happened. Let's not forget, though, as we're dealing with this, Prof, you asked about the interference in internal affairs. Now, I assume that you either teach or are a student of diplomacy. So let me respond to you as a teacher of diplomacy. The term interference in internal affairs now expressly excludes pronouncements on universally agreed values. The same way that an ambassador of Zimbabwe can pronounce themselves on climate change in any country, and might actually be brought by the government to come and speak on a subject like Black History Month, as long as it's on universal value. What is different is if the ambassador begins to take sides with any political actor. When they pronounce themselves on violations of rights, are they double standards? And I think you raise a fundamental point. I personally don't think Western ambassadors, I've listened to them in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, and listened to them in Kenya, they tend to behave like local activists. And sometimes not for the reasons that you've raised, but as one who for many years was struggling leading local organizations, is sometimes this excitement on their part actually undermines the struggle by locals, because it gives dictators and autocrats an excuse for dismissing legitimate social struggle as a paid activism by foreign interests. But should we balk at this? I have a beautiful video by Tongogara. If you Google, you'll find it on the internet, where Tongogara says, he points at his shoes and says, if it were not for the donors in Sweden, I would not be wearing this shoe. If it were not for people here, I would not have this gun or this jacket. He points to international solidarity. There's nothing new about international solidarity. As long as the agenda is not being set by international solidarity, it would be pretentious for anyone running South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, or Mozambique or Angola to say they liberated their countries without external solidarity from the United Kingdom, from Sweden, from elsewhere. As a Pan-Africanist, the question I ask is simple. What are the parameters of solidarity? Right? What is my struggle and what is their role? Because sometimes foreign actors don't know when to stop when they have finished. But we should not allow a regime to become the moral judge of who we associate with. Because when they go and sell the country off to China or sell the country off to Russia, for some reason, the race of those people doesn't matter. Their being foreign doesn't matter. The fact that the benefit is not accruing to locals doesn't matter. So I think we cannot speak from both sides of our mouth. If all foreign interests must be excluded, let all be excluded. Interference does not mean you cannot pronounce yourself on a universal value question, such as rights. And I think that it would be overstretching. It means you cannot meddle and become a political actor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. In the interest of time, I will ask that Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo and Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, you keep your questions, your answers brief, as we will be wrapping up in the next few minutes. But I will now pose 2 questions to Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo from the chat box. The first one, on the issue of ethics and principle. You mentioned that the issue of legitimacy dates back to the November coup d'etat. Yet back in 2017, the leadership of MDC, along with other opposition leaders, took the position that there was no coup in Zimbabwe. Does MDC now, in hindsight, see that the position they took in 2017 to endorse the military takeover was a mistake? The second question, you define the problem in Zimbabwe as one that rises from the disputed elections in the past. That said, what would you say is the practical significance and impact of the African Charter on democracy, elections, and governance in Africa today? Furthermore, what is your brief comment on the near silence among SADC and AU leaders on the situation in Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. Let me just try to put on my video. Okay, I will start with the questions on the coup. I think it's important to set the record straight. What the MDC-Alliance said, and I think this was something that was shared, by the generality of Zimbabweans and also generality of, players also, on the international stage. What we said was that, given the challenges where we were coming from, with the long rule of Mr. Mugabe, perhaps, what happened in November, 2017 was an opportunity to change the narrative in Zimbabwe. With the benefit of hindsight, we have seen, just like, many of the players in Zimbabwe and also, internationally, that perhaps we made a mistake by, giving, a chance to Mr. Mnangagwa, and, the happenings in November 2017. So I do agree with the person who posed the question that perhaps, we could have done things differently. And we hope that, going forward, we'll keep that experience. I mean, experience is always the best teacher. And we have seen that maybe we made a mistake, and you know, going forward, we'll obviously be on the lookout in terms of making sure that we stick, you know, to what needs to be done to extricate Zimbabwe, you know, out of the crisis in a sustainable way. You know, the challenge always is to, you know, to say what comes first, you know, sustain, what do you call it, stability and democracy. And obviously, you know, democracy is very important even for sustainability. Sustainability that is not based on democracy is not sustainability at all. So even as we talk about, you know, looking for a solution, you know, to the current crisis in Zimbabwe, we also need to make sure that we do not sacrifice democracy. The people are supreme in everything that we do, and the people must decide the, you know, the future of Zimbabwe. So it's an experience that we had, and we hope we will learn from it. On the SADC question, obviously, given the magnitude of the problem in Zimbabwe and how protracted it has been, we were of the view that, you know, Southern African Development Community leaders who met on the 17th of August were supposed to also, you know, speak to the crisis in Zimbabwe and to come up with concrete, you know, solutions. You know, if you look at the protocol on, you know, politics, defense, and security, it does have mechanisms that can be useful in terms of a SADC intervention in Zimbabwe. And we continuously, you know, call on SADC to, you know, intervene. As a political party, we have said dialogue, in our opinion, is the best way to proceed. And in the absence of trust, you know, and deep polarization in Zimbabwe, it will be very difficult to find someone internally who can, you know, play that facilitator role, which is why we have called upon the international community, you know, to provide that platform where Zimbabweans can discuss, you know, how to find a lasting solution. So obviously, the outcomes of that SADC summit were, you know, a letdown because we had expected that Zimbabwe was supposed to be, you know, discussed given, you know, the prevailing crisis. But we are also aware that the particular organ that is supposed to look into peace and security issues, you know, the organ on politics, defense, and security, was an organ that was also being headed by Mr. Mnangagwa, who is being accused of, you know, taking advantage of the COVID-19 lockdown to go after, you know, his opponents. And so obviously there are also challenges around that. We welcome the fact that, yes, he's still in the organ, but Botswana has taken over as the chairperson of the organ on politics and defense and security. And also South Africa is now the deputy chair of that particular organ. So we are going to continuously engage as a political party with those particular countries to make them see sense in a SADC intervention. Because like what Brian was saying, like what Brian was rightfully saying, you know, the implications regionally are huge. The number of Zimbabweans that are in the diaspora, if you look at issues around xenophobia, you know, some of them can be traced back to the crisis in countries such as Zimbabwe. So we need to make sure that, you know, Zimbabwe works for everyone. Zimbabwe becomes, you know, a home for Zimbabweans where they can, you know, come back and contribute, and not necessarily, you know, go to, you know, migrate to other countries as political and economic refugees. So we need to fix Zimbabwe so that we can also, you know, stop the illegal migration that we are seeing. I've always said that, you know, for South Africa, Zimbabwe is not a domestic policy matter, but, you know, it's not a foreign policy matter, but it's actually a domestic policy matter, because what is happening here has ramifications on, on what happens in South Africa. Our people are putting a lot of pressure in terms of the socio-economic infrastructure, resulting in some of the disturbances that we have seen, xenophobia and things like that, which is why it's important for the region to pay attention. Botswana is also receiving a lot of political and economic refugees from Zimbabwe. So it's important for SADC to play that facilitator role in terms of assisting Zimbabwean actors and stakeholders to come up with a lasting solution. The third question, sorry, if you can just repeat it. I think it was around adage.
Unfortunately, in the interests of time, we will have to move on to just the final questions for Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe. But thank you very much for tendering your response in this regard. But to Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, in February of 2020, Zimbabwe joined the African Peer Review Mechanism. Has there been any discussion of this in Zimbabwe, and could the process act as a platform to genuinely solve problems? Furthermore, what then is the role of the international community in the plight of Zimbabweans?
Thanks, Ruvimbo. In terms of whether the PRM has had any effect so far in Zimbabwe, to my knowledge, there hasn't been much that has been done in terms of incorporating it and also having Zimbabwe be held accountable through that platform. But at the same time, I think it's an opportunity that we have, it's an opportunity that we may use, and it's an opportunity that we shouldn't castigate before saying what it will bring to the process. And it's one component of the struggle, it's one component of seeking to change the situation in Zimbabwe, because on its own, it will not bring the much needed change that we need and the much needed hope that we need, particularly in light of all the facets of this situation that we have had from the panelists. And I think as a country, we have to certainly be alive to that, and particularly civil society, making sure that we tap into the APRM and also seeing what the APRM has done in the past within the region. It's also useful to see how we can integrate and how we can ensure that we use that platform and we reap the benefits of it. Sorry, I didn't get the second part of the question.
The second part of the question was then to just discuss the general role of the international community in civic movements in Zimbabwe.
I think Brian has aptly said that we certainly cannot rule out that we don't need the support of the international community. We do, and it brings a component in terms of putting pressure, and also a component in terms of bringing to life what we are already doing in Zimbabwe. I will stress that the civil society sector in Zimbabwe, they're doing tremendous work and they're doing highly remarkable work in terms of trying to get the rule of law, constitutionalism back in place. But there's certainly so many hurdles along the way, and this is what we are seeing now. And it probably takes so much more, and it will probably take much longer than we have anticipated in terms of seeing change. But I would like to say that the political parties in our country also need to be part of this process, and they also need to approach this with more open-minded approach. So one of the factors that we know is that as Zimbabweans, well, particularly the majority of Zimbabweans have really suffered through the process of what is going on right now. We have really seen the dire effects that the situation has right now on every one of us. And with this, the goal is, I think, for the majority of people to just have a Zimbabwe that works for them, to have a Zimbabwe that provides the basic commodities, for example, to have a Zimbabwe that gives you a job when you complete your studies, to have a Zimbabwe here you actually have a hope for your family, hope for your children, and to see them flourish in the country. So the idea now is, what and who are we fighting against? I would like to reiterate and emphasize that we are fighting against a system, and we are fighting against the structures that have, upheld corruption, that have upheld governance inefficiencies. But the people who are holding the power right now, and the people who are holding the will that we need to change the trajectory of the country, really need to take a step back and really need to consider that Zimbabwe can actually move from where we are and into a new direction. And at the same time, that inclusion, diversity, and equality are things that we cannot take for granted. And they're things that we need for us to have a Zimbabwe that works for everyone at the end of the day. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and to all our participants as well. Thank you all for your submitted questions, and to our invited panelists, Ms. Ruwadzano Makumbe, Ms. Gladys Hlatywayo, and Mr. Brian Kagoro, for shedding light to this critical discussion and for taking time to engage in this meaningful dialogue. To our participants, your engagement is not taken lightly, and we appreciate your honest feedback on the matters presented. But unfortunately, this is about all of the time that we have for our session today. So please kindly look out for a follow-up email proceeding from this event, summarizing the conclusions of this meeting, as well as a link to the video recording. But on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, I'd like to extend a final thank you to you all, and we are sincerely looking forward to convening again.